All right, thanks so much for being here. Today we want to talk about what we saw in this pandemic. Letting folks settle in. One of the one of the most tragic parts of this pandemic, what I've called and many people have noted as a national shame, has been how our loved ones and seniors in long-term care bore the brunt of this pandemic with their lives. And what we've also learned in particular is that the worst conditions of care were in the for-profit homes. That's why today we're standing behind, or I'm standing behind me, is a Rivera-owned long-term care home, the Eiler Lodge. Uh, Rivera is wholly owned by a federal crown corporation. It's owned effectively by the federal government. And we've said really clearly that we need to get profit out of long-term care. And we can start with Rivera because it is completely something within the powers of the federal government to deal with, to make sure it is no longer a for-profit operation. Even the workers whose pension owns this have said really clearly, we do not want to own a for-profit long-term care home. And when we talk about what this means, recently there's an inquiry going into what happened in Quebec in some of the for-profit homes. And they have described some of the most horrible conditions possible that our loved ones and seniors could have been kept in. That's the reality. When you've got a for-profit home, that means profit is put ahead of people. That means people end up suffering. And when we said we should get profit out of long-term care, we should get the greed out of long-term care, Mr. Trudeau teamed up with Mr. O'Toole to vote against that, meaning they voted for private care. They voted to continue that sort of delivery. And so when people talk about, who is for or against private or public care, we've got evidence. When it comes to long-term care, Mr. Trudeau sided with Mr. O'Toole against you and your families for private care, for greed, for putting profit ahead of our loved ones. And we think that's absolutely wrong. New Democrats will fight back, make sure we get the profit out of long-term care, make sure we put seniors and our loved ones first, and make sure that their care is first. This is just another example of how it costs you and your families. Voting for Mr. Trudeau has a cost. It means that long-term care, for-profit care will continue. It means that life will continue to be more expensive. We're seeing a housing crisis and the costs have gone up under Mr. Trudeau. The national price of a home, the national average price has gone up by $300,000 since he took office. The cost of rent has gone up. We know that he promised to lower the cost of cell phone and internet bills, and he hasn't done that. That costs you and your families. These are things that we can actually achieve. He promised to bring in pharmacare and didn't. That costs your families thousands of dollars a year. We can change this. We don't have to settle with someone who promises things and doesn't deliver, and it means that you and your families pay the price. We don't have to settle with someone who believes in for-profit care when we believe strongly that the only way to care for our loved ones is public care that puts people first, that put our loved ones first. That's a choice that you can make. And I want to be really clear. I think Mr. Trudeau is going to cost you. I also think Mr. O'Toole is going to cost you. He absolutely believes in for-profit delivery of long-term care because he voted against removing it. He also doesn't want to make your life more affordable. He's going to make things cost more. So really, what does that leave you with? If you want someone that's on your side, that's going to make life more affordable, that's going to make you the priority, New Democrats are your option. And here in Essex, that means Tracy Ramsey. And in the Windsor area, it means our team, Cheryl Hardcastle and Brian Massey. And across Canada, find your New Democrat candidate and vote. If you want any of these things to happen, if you want to get profit out of long-term care, if you want to make sure that the billionaires start paying their fair share, the only way to get that is to vote New Democrat. Donc aujourd'hui, on est devant un centre de soins de longue durée à but lucratif. Et la raison pour laquelle on est ici, c'est pendant cette pandémie, ce qui était une honte nationale, c'était le fait que nos aînés dans les centres de soins de longue durée étaient les plus frappés par la COVID-19. Donc, ça, c'est pourquoi on a dit qu'on doit éliminer les profits dans les centres de soins de longue durée. On doit éliminer cette sorte de service. On doit s'assurer que nos aînés, nos proches sont la priorité, pas les profits. Donc, quand on a proposé une motion pour enlever les profits dans les centres de soins de longue durée, commençons avec Rivera, qui est une agence propriétaire du gouvernement fédéral. M. Trudeau a travaillé ensemble avec M. O'Toole pour dire non. Donc, ça veut dire qu'ils sont contre l'idée d'avoir des services publics. Ils sont pour les centres de soins de longue durée à but lucratif. Et c'est la mauvaise chose à faire. Donc, j'encore exige les gens. On ne peut pas se permettre 4 ans de plus de M. Trudeau. Ça coûte trop cher. Ses promesses brisées blessent les gens. Quand il promet d'investir dans une assurance médicament universelle et brise sa promesse, ça va coûter les gens plus d'argent. Quand il promet de réduire les coûts des factures de services cellulaires et Internet et il ne l'a pas fait, ça coûte trop cher et on doit payer le prix. Mais on a une option. On ne doit pas continuer avec les libéraux ou les conservateurs. On peut voter pour l'NPD. Donc, si vous voulez voir un gouvernement qui fait payer le juste part des ultra-riches, qui enlève les profits dans les centres de soins de longue durée, qui vraiment réduit les factures pour les services cellulaires et pour les services d'Internet, vous pouvez voter pour l'NPD. On est là pour vous. Il faut oser et on peut bâtir une meilleure société. Thanks so much. I want to thank all the healthcare workers. We're standing here with some frontline workers, personal support workers, and frontline healthcare workers. We are with them. There is no reason that healthcare workers should be faced with any sort of what we're seeing, the protests against healthcare workers. These are folks that are burnt out. They're caring for our loved ones. They're sacrificing so much. They're giving so much. We stand with them. We're in solidarity with them. We believe they deserve good wages, good pay, good resources so they can take care of our loved ones. They are doing their best. When I talk about the for-profit model, it is no criticism of the workers. It's a criticism of a system that means that they're underfunded, underpaid, under-resourced. These workers care deeply, and I've spoken with so many that love and care so deeply for the residents of their homes. They want to provide the care, and they work themselves to the bone because they don't know how to do it, because they don't have the resources, they don't have the staffing. And so we're with them, and I want to thank them for being with us today. With that, I'm ready for any questions you might have.
First question, we have Olivia Stefanovich from CBC News.
Good morning, Mr. Singh.
Good
Two of
morning.
your candidates have quit, promising to learn more about anti Semitism. You've said that there is no room for discrimination or racism in your party, and yet these candidates have had to resign. You didn't ask them to leave. Why is that? What does that say about your leadership? And why weren't these comments found in the vetting process? What was wrong with your vetting process?
These candidates made a decision to leave. I think that was the right decision. I want to be very clear. Their comments were completely wrong and have no place in our party. They made a decision, and I think it was the right decision.
But why didn't you ask to kick them out? Why didn't you ask them to leave? And what do you say to those constituents who are in these ridings hoping to vote for an NDP candidate who don't have one anymore?
In this case, these candidates made the right decision. They made the decision, and I support them in that decision. I think it's the right decision. In addition, they're talking about the importance of getting training. Anti-Semitism is real. We're seeing a scary rise in anti-Semitism, and we are unequivocally opposed and will confront it and we'll deal with it wherever it is. I want folks to know that our values are values of inclusivity, making sure everyone feels welcome, and like making sure everyone feels like they belong. Those messages were completely unacceptable, and the right decision was made.
En français, s'il te plaît.
Nos candidats et candidates ont pris une décision. On pense que c'était la bonne décision. Leurs propos, ce qu'ils ont envoyé comme message sur les médias sociaux, c'était complètement inacceptable. Donc, on est d'accord avec leur décision. Et notre parti est un parti d'inclusivité. On sait qu'il y a une hausse, une monte de antisémitisme. C'est vraiment une menace. Donc, notre parti va toujours être contre l'antisémitisme et on est toujours un allié pour défendre une société juste, égale, inclusive et une société sans discrimination. Donc, on appuie la décision et on va continuer de montrer leadership, de bâtir une société où on n'a pas de discrimination.
Next question, Robin Gill, Global News.
Good morning, Mr. Singh. With Global News' continuing coverage of sexual misconduct in the military, do you believe that the military police should be investigating their own when it comes to sexual assault? Or if elected, would you implement an independent watchdog with these cases?
Really appreciate the question. And just for context, for women in the Canadian Forces and women across Canada, the fact that a serious complaint concern was raised, and that complaint and that concern was raised and made it to the desk of the Prime Minister, made it to the Defense Minister, and nothing was done, sent a really chilling message that women are not listened to, are not heard. Their concerns are not heard. And what we've learned over this past 6 years is that there was a report, we knew this before, there's a report, Deschamps report, from 2015 that outlined very clearly that there has to be an independent process. That was the number one recommendation of the Deschamps report. So yes, 100% we need to have an independent process. That was a complaint raised by, that was a major concern raised by Justice Deschamps, and who was a Supreme Court judge. And despite knowing that, to this date, after 6 years of having this report, 6 years of being in power, Mr. Trudeau has not done that. And instead, he is now launching another inquiry with another justice from the Supreme Court, who's an incredible justice. But it highlights that why is he not actually putting in place the number one recommendation, which is an independent process. So yes, we need an independent process. No, it should not be that the investigation happens internally, because we know the problems with that. It doesn't allow for people to come forward. They don't feel safe to come forward. And often their concerns are not even listened to. So we need to implement this. And Mr. Trudeau had 6 years to do it. It is an offense to the principles of making sure that our workplaces are safe, that he has not implemented this.
Second question. We're so close to election day. The race is very close. Do you worry that people are going to strategically park their votes with the Liberals and take support away from you because they're panicking at the end?
I know that this is going to be an argument that the Liberals are going to raise, and they kind of done it every single time. Every election, right near the end, they say, okay, now you got to vote strategically. But I want folks to know there is a cost to voting for Mr. Trudeau. It costs you and your families. It costs you when he promises to lower the cost of cell phone bills, and he doesn't. It'll literally cost you $1,000 a year, because that's what he promised to do, and he hasn't done it. So that's $2,000 that families should have saved since the time he promised it, that they haven't saved. When he promises to bring in pharmacare for families that need medication, and it's a lot of families, that is thousands of dollars that they could have saved. And when he doesn't do it, that's $1,000 that you continue to spend. When people can't afford to buy a home that's in their budget, and the cost of housing has gone up so high, there is a cost to voting for Mr. Trudeau. The housing crisis isn't fixed. So I want folks to know there is a cost to voting for Mr. Trudeau. There's absolutely a cost to voting for Mr. O'Toole. He agrees with Mr. Trudeau on a number of things. He agrees they are both opposed to pharmacare. They are both opposed to removing profit out of long-term care. And they're both opposed to making the billionaires pay their fair share, because that's the way they voted. They're both opposed to those things. New Democrats are your option if you want to remove profit from long-term care, if you want to see someone that's going to take on the big telco companies and make them lower their prices, if you want to make sure that the billionaires pay their fair share, that companies like Amazon start contributing fairly in Canada. New Democrats are your choice. We are the ones that will fight for you. We have fought for you in this pandemic, and we will continue to do that.
En français, s'il te plaît.
Oui, je sais, chaque élection, c'est exactement ce que les libéraux font. Il dit que vous devez voter pour les libéraux pour arrêter les conservateurs. Mais il y a un prix de voter pour les libéraux. Le prix, c'est chaque promesse brisée, ça coûte cher. Quand M. Trudeau a dit il y a 2 ans qu'il va réduire les coûts des services cellulaires, il a dit que ça va réduire les coûts pour chaque famille presque $1,000. C'était 2 ans. Il a brisé sa promesse, ça coûte $2,000 pour chaque famille. Quand il a dit qu'il va mettre en œuvre une assurance médicaments, et il a brisé sa promesse, ça coûte des familles des milliers de dollars pour acheter le médicament. Donc ça coûte cher, les crises climatiques augmentent, cette crise s'empire, les émissions augmentent. Donc il y a un prix, parce qu'il y a l'inaction de M. Trudeau coûte trop cher. Donc si vous voulez voir un gouvernement qui fait payer le juste part des ultra riches, c'est l'NPD. Si vous voulez voir un gouvernement qui dit qu'on ne doit pas avoir des profits dans les centres de soins de longue durée, vous devez voter NPD. Si vous voulez un gouvernement qui dit clairement qu'on va toujours se battre pour vous, c'est l'NPD.
Next question, Raisa Patel from the Toronto Star.
in the last days of this election, how are you changing and approaching the way you're campaigning in this final push?
We're going to continue to fight for Canadians, and we're going to continue to let Canadians know they can count on us. And one of the big questions that we keep on hearing and the people are really worried about is who's going to pay for this pandemic and who's going to pay for the recovery. And the reason why people are worried is they've seen Liberals and Conservatives do the same thing. They've seen them do it every single time when we come out of an economic crisis. Either they cut the help to people. I want to remind folks, Mr. Trudeau's already started doing that. He's cut the CRE, so he's cut the support that some folks need by $800 a month. These are folks that can't go back to work, that have no jobs yet because their sectors are still shut down, tourism and the festival sectors where artists and folks that rely on large gatherings, they can't do that work. So he's cut help to people already, or they will put the burden back on people by increasing taxes. We are the only party saying we're going to make sure that the wealthy corporations, the large foreign companies that make profits in Canada that don't pay their taxes here, those folks that use offshore tax havens will start paying their fair share so we can invest in you. That's the question that's on a lot of folks' mind, and we're the ones that are going to deliver.
You're spending a few hours this evening streaming on the gaming platform Twitch with Election Day just a few days away. Why so much emphasis on that platform today?
Well, it's going to be in the evening, so it's going to be tough to knock on doors or meet folks in the evening. So it's a good use of my evening time, I feel like. But it's important to speak to people where they are. And that's one of the things that we've done throughout the campaign, but also throughout my leadership. I want to be able to reach people where they are. And if there are folks that gather on a certain platform, you can be sure that I'll try to find a way to reach out and connect and be there. And so we're going to use this as a platform, as an opportunity to share what we believe in, have a little fun, but also encourage people to get out and vote. One of the most important things to do right now is if you want any of the things that we're talking about, if you believe in these things, you have to vote. So my message is please get out and vote. It is your power. It is your ability to vote that's going to make the difference. So please use that power.
Prochaine question, Jean-Sébastien Cloutier, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour, M. Singh. Je veux revenir sur le vote stratégique qui a quand même fonctionné pour les libéraux en 2015, qui a fonctionné en 2019. Comprenez-vous quand même certains électeurs progressistes qui ne veulent pas les conservateurs et qui vont voter libéral parce que c'est eux qui ont probablement le plus de chances aujourd'hui de gagner?
Je sais que c'est un argument que les libéraux ont utilisé à plusieurs reprises, mais je veux parler directement aux progressistes. M. Trudeau se présente comme il est un progressiste, mais c'est quoi son bilan? Si on parle de l'environnement, est-ce que c'est progressiste au lieu d'éliminer les subventions aux pétrolières, de les augmenter? Non. Est-ce que c'est progressiste de dire qu'on va réduire les émissions et au lieu de les réduire, les augmenter? Non. À chaque fois, on peut montrer comment M. Trudeau a défendu les intérêts les plus riches, les ultra riches. Il y a quelques journées, il a dit clairement, on ne peut pas faire payer les justes parts des ultra riches. On ne doit pas le faire. En disant ça, il a présenté encore comment il n'est pas l'option progressiste. Il est quelqu'un qui veut défendre les ultra riches. Donc, pour les progressistes, si vous voulez voir quelqu'un qui est vraiment de votre part, qui va se battre pour vous, qui va faire payer le juste part des ultra riches, pour investir dans les soins de santé, pour faire face à la crise climatique, pour faire face aux crises du logement, pour vous aider et bâtir une meilleure société, on devait oser en votant pour l'NPD.
In English, please.
I know that Mr. Trudeau is going to make the same argument that Liberals often do about voting a certain way to be strategic, and he's going to appeal to progressive voters. To those progressives, I want to speak to you directly. Mr. Trudeau has held himself out to be a progressive, but is it progressive to promise to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and then instead to increase them and to increase them to the levels higher than that of Mr. Harper and the Conservatives? Is it no? And is it progressive to promise to reduce emissions only to increase them year over year? No. Is it progressive to promise to bring in pharmacare and then to vote against it at the first opportunity? No. Mr. Trudeau has shown again and again, not only is he not the progressive option, but he is someone who wants to defend the ultra-rich. We've got a number of examples, clear proof points. And if we needed more proof, just a couple of days ago, he said really clearly, we can't go after the super wealthy with unlimited zeal. he basically made it clear that he is defending the super rich. And for anyone wondering where he stands, he made it clear. But before that, we know he voted against an motion to tax those super wealthy, the ultra rich, the billionaires. He voted against getting profit out of long term care. He voted against pharmacare, something that he campaigned on and promised 2 years ago. He voted against it. So, to progressives out there, voting for Mr. Trudeau is going to cost you too much. It costs you too much when he promises clean drinking water and breaks that promise for Indigenous kids who still don't have access to clean drinking water. It costs you too much when he promises to lower the cost of cell phone and internet fees and breaks that promise, siding with the telco companies. It costs you too much. It's not a free vote. It's not even a strategic vote. It costs you too much to vote for the Liberals. We're saying if you want someone on your side, if you want someone who's going to fight for you, who's going to stand up to the powerful, to the ultra rich, it's New Democrats. So I encourage you all in this region in Windsor, Essex. You got Tracy Ramsey, you got Cheryl Hardcastle, you got Brian Massey. That's your option. Who's going to fight for you, who's going to stand up for you. That's a truly progressive option.
Et en sous-question, de façon réaliste, s'il n'y a pas de vote stratégique, évidemment, vous allez avoir plus de circonscriptions, les libéraux un peu moins, mais vous êtes conscient que ça ouvre grande la porte aux conservateurs qui sont probablement encore plus éloignés de vos valeurs. Ça, c'est une réalité, M. Singh, vous le savez.
Mais c'est une question intéressante. Je respecte la question parce que dans le passé, avant d'être un chef, peut-être je vais admettre que j'aurais admis que oui, c'est le cas. Mais dans ces 5 ans, cette 3 ans comme chef et dans les 6 ans de voir M. Trudeau, je ne suis pas d'accord parce que pour quand il compte, pour les enjeux qui comptent, donc faire payer le juste part des ultra riches, malheureusement, M. Trudeau est plus proche de M. O'Toole. Ils ont voté ensemble contre l'idée de faire payer le juste part des ultra riches. Donc, ce n'est pas une question hypothétique. On a les preuves. Pour moi, une valeur essentielle parce que quand j'ai vu l'impact de cette pandémie sur les vies de nos proches dans les centres de soins de longue durée, et la preuve qui est claire que les centres à but lucratif sont les pires, le fait que M. Trudeau a voté ensemble avec M. O'Toole pour contre l'idée d'éliminer les profits dans ces centres, ça montre encore comment leurs valeurs sont plus proches que j'ai jamais pensé. Et encore, quand il a promis d'avoir une assurance médicaments universelle, quelque chose qui va aider tous les gens à travers le pays, le fait qu'il y a la première fois qu'on a eu la chance de voter sur cette question, il a voté non avec les conservateurs, encore il a monté peut-être non. Ses valeurs sont plus proches dans ce cas des conservateurs que les miennes, que le nôtre comme un parti néo-démocratique. Donc on a la preuve qui montre malheureusement pour les choses qui comptent dans cette pandémie, santé, centre de soins de longue durée, faire payer les justes parts des ultra riches, ces trois enjeux primordiaux, c'est clair que les libéraux et les conservateurs sont plus proches que nous, qui sont clairement du bord des gens, et eux qui sont du bord des ultra riches.
Next question, Minako Raman Wilms from the Golden Mail.
Hello, Mr. Singh. As we've talked about already this morning, the Liberals are once again telling voters they are the only party that can stop the Conservatives. But this Conservative leader seems to be more progressive than his predecessor and frankly, may not concern people as much as the Conservative Party under a different leader. So do you think voters can feel better supporting the NDP this election because of that?
You should feel better about supporting the NDP in any election. We're always going to have your back. We're always going to fight for you, and you are better off with the New Democrat always. But it's a fair point to bring up. People shouldn't be afraid. Don't be afraid. There are just some clear decisions in front of us. If you care about certain things, there are certain options there. If you were a billionaire and you're someone who uses offshore tax havens and you've got a bunch of loopholes that mean you don't pay your fair share, you're probably going to want to vote for either liberals or conservatives. I'll be honest with you, yes. But if you don't have an offshore tax haven, if you are not a billionaire, if you're not a wealthy corporation that makes lots of money in Canada that hides their profits, doesn't pay their fair share, then you definitely want to vote for New Democrats. It is pretty clear we are on your side. So again, the choices. If you believe that for-profit long-term care homes should not continue to operate for profit, that they should be operating in the public good, in the good of our loved ones, then New Democrats are your option. And I don't want you to be afraid of either the Liberals or the Conservatives. I want you to make a decision based on what you care about, what's important to you, what's important to your families. If you care about medication coverage, if that's something that matters to you, we're the ones fighting for it. It's not going to be the Liberals, it's not going to be the Conservatives. If you care about these things, I want you to vote for them. I don't want you to be afraid. Don't be scared. Vote the way your heart tells you, and don't let anyone tell you you can't do it. Don't let anyone tell you that it's not possible. If enough of you vote New Democrat, we can form government, and we will make a big difference in people's lives.
And last night here in Windsor, you held a rally inside a small airplane hangar with quite a substantial crowd, and there was limited social distancing. Supporters were crowded together and crowded around you. What do you say to people who are concerned that some of these campaign events are too large, especially when we're dealing with a fourth COVID-19 wave and a Delta variant?
I understand people's concerns. I'll reiterate what we said, that this election shouldn't have been called in the first place. It was a selfish decision by Mr. Trudeau to call an election with the fourth wave, with the challenges that we're dealing with the forest fires and the climate crisis, with the various challenges and crises that we're up against. We should have been working on those, not in an election. Mr. Trudeau made a bad decision to call this election, and we're seeing why it was so bad. We always try to do our best to make sure we're outdoors or in well-ventilated areas. We had the hangar doors open, but it's a fair point to raise. We're going to be as vigilant as possible while we're having our events, that we are following the best guidelines we can. And we always also encourage our events to be a limit, to follow the limits of the province, and we try our best to follow those guidelines.
Next question, Annie Bergeron-Oliver from CTV News.
Hi, Mr. Singh. You have spent almost every day of this campaign naming and specifically attacking Amazon for not paying its fair share. Today, you are bringing your nationwide platform and essentially a major endorsement to Twitch. This is a $5 billion company fully owned by Amazon. Why do you think it's acceptable to bring your platform to this company that you have been attacking the entire campaign? Do you not think it sends the wrong message to Canadians and to voters?
I'm going to use any platform that I can to reach out to people and to speak to people and to communicate and connect and share our message. I'm not going to be limited by that. It also doesn't mean that I'm going to ever back down from criticizing. I'm going to use a platform, but I'm going to hear me tomorrow also criticizing Amazon for not paying their fair share until they start paying their fair share. And it doesn't mean I'm going to stop. And if it means that my Twitch stream goes down, maybe you know who did it. But in all honesty, I'm going to use every platform I can to spread the message. But what I think is important is we're not going to back down. I still use my cell phone, even though I think the telecom companies are exploiting people. I'm still going to use my cell phone to communicate with people, to use it as a tool to reach out and express our views. But we're still going to criticize the telecom companies. So if my bill goes up, maybe. But I want to be clear. Like, we will use the platforms we can. We will use the tools that we can to convey our messages. But we'll never back down from the ideas and the principles that those who don't pay their fair share have to start, and we can build a better world if everyone contributes fairly.
And a follow-up question. You were asked earlier by my colleague Olivia about the vetting process and whether the comments that your two candidates made should have been found. You didn't really answer that one, so I'd like to just go back. I'm wondering if you can talk to us a bit about the vetting process that goes into these candidates, and do you think that better vetting should have been done? Do you view it as a failure that these comments did not surface and they were allowed to run?
Vetting in general is tricky, given the change in times where people have different platforms now, and sometimes these platforms can go back for years and years. So it is more of a challenge to vet candidates. It is something that we're constantly working on improving and working on finding better ways to do. It is a challenge, and it's fair to say that we will always find ways to try to improve our process and do a better job of it.
Next question, Karina Roman, CBC News.
I also want to just talk about those two candidates in terms of yesterday. You said an apology was the right decision. Today you're saying a resignation is the right decision. What does that say about your leadership, that what the right decision is changes from day to day?
Well, it's certainly right to apologize. It's always right to apologize. People, if they make a mistake, should apologize. That's always the right thing to do. And in this case, they made a decision to go further than that. And I support that decision. I think it was right, given the circumstances.
And in terms of long-term care and your message about trying to take profits out of long-term care, can you perhaps tell Canadians exactly how you plan to do that when this is clearly provincial jurisdiction? How are you going to tell the provinces to overhaul their whole systems? Is it just about changing the Canada Health Act? Or like, I don't think it's really clear on how you plan to actually change the whole long-term care system in Canada when it's actually not a federal jurisdiction.
I really appreciate the question. We had the same problem, the exact same struggle when we brought in universal health care. They were private, for-profit hospitals. And at the time, a lot of people said, well, there's no way we're ever going to be able to deal with this. There's all these private, for-profit hospitals. What are we going to do? We dealt with it. It wasn't easy. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but there was the exact same problem. There were private, for-profit hospitals that are operating in Canada. We worked together and we're able to eliminate the for-profit delivery, and we have public delivery of care in our hospitals now. And that was a better thing. It's one of the things that Canadians are most proud of. Similarly, right now, there is a mistake that private delivery of long-term care is wrong. And it is shown to be wrong with all the evidence. Given that evidence, that is so clear that the worst conditions, horrible conditions, where our loved ones were left unattended, left to get dehydrated, malnourished, and that happened disproportionately higher in for-profit care, then we've got to do something about it. We can't just sit back and say, oh, it's not my job. If we had that approach, we would never have universal health care. It took federal leadership to say, let's bring provinces together, let's bring territories together, and let's do this. Similarly, what I'm saying now is, let's do this. Let's not let for-profit care continue in our long-term care homes. Let's end that delivery model because it hurts our loved ones. It is wrong. So what can we do to start? Well, Revera, which is the second largest provider of long-term care homes, the home behind me is owned by Revera and operated by Revera. This is right now owned by a federal agency. It is completely owned by a federal agency. It is fully within the powers of the federal government to start to remove long-term care for-profit model with Revera. Start with Revera. We can start right there. And that's going to be, that's a lot of homes, that's a lot of people that we can move away from the for-profit delivery. And then, yeah, it's going to be a hard task. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but we can work with provinces and territories. We can use the Canada Health Act or another act that applies the same principles that we've agreed upon, that care should be publicly delivered, it should be universal, it should be accessible, it should be integrated, you should be able to get it from one province to another. Use those same principles, the way we did to get rid of private operating hospitals, and use that same principle to work towards eliminating all for-profit care when it comes to long-term care. We can do it. I don't question at all the ability for us to do it. It will be hard, but it is so hard to see the lives that were lost in long-term care. It is so hard to see the horrible conditions of care that we have to act.
Next question, Kelly Malone, Canadian Press.
You're promising more spending over the next few years that an independent analysis says would drive up price as the economy recovers. Could you foresee a scenario where you rethink spending plans if your measures create inflationary pressures? Why or why not?
Well, we are concerned with inflation, and we know that's a concern that's on a lot of folks' minds. And one of the major drivers of inflation is housing prices. And we know that that's something that makes life harder for people. So we've got a plan to tackle that. When the analysis was done around inflation, one of the primary drivers is the fact that the cost of owning a home keeps on going up and people's wages haven't. So it's getting harder and harder for people. We can fix this. There are solutions. There are ways for us to tackle the housing crisis, and we're committed to doing that. What I'm not committed to, or what I'm not going to allow to happen is if we don't invest in people, what we have seen anytime we come out of an economic crisis, if you are very wealthy, if you're super rich, if you're the ultra rich, you do really fine. In fact, you do fine in the crisis, and then coming out of it, you do even better. That's what we've seen. The 44 wealthiest billionaires in Canada increased their wealth by 78 billion in the pandemic. But for a working class person, a middle class person, when you go through an economic crisis and there aren't supports in place, things get even worse. The struggles get harder. And if we don't invest in people, if we don't spend in our healthcare, don't make life more affordable, then they're the ones that are going to end up paying the price. And I can't accept that. And that's why I believe investing in people.
Canadian climate scientists the Canadian Press has interviewed say that no new offshore oil and gas wells should be permitted in the mandate of the next government as part of Canada's effort in the climate change emergency to reach zero emissions. What's your position on whether your government would allow any further new offshore oil and natural gas wells off Nova Scotia or Newfoundland in the next federal government's mandate? What will you do to transition people in the industry to new forms of work? And should the mandate of the federal provincial boards to promote offshore oil and gas projects be removed?
We've got in front of us a really serious challenge, and that's the climate crisis. And we're seeing the impacts of it right now in our lives. It's not, and I think people have accepted it's no longer this distant future worry. We are worried for the future of our kids, but we know the impacts are being felt right now. Given that, we've got to make some tough decisions. And those tough decisions are, how can we invest in a future where we can ensure that there's good jobs, as well as make sure that we are fighting the climate crisis? So what I want to do, my plan is, we've got to end the fossil fuel subsidies. That's a concrete step we can take right away, and that's something immediately that a new Democratic government would do. We would end the fossil fuel subsidies that Mr. Trudeau promised to end, and instead of ending, he's increased. And that costs us, because that's resources that we could use towards investing in renewable energy, in supporting workers, in providing them with real jobs that will be there in the long term. There's a lot of workers that are dealing with the volatility of the energy sector. It's tough on those workers. We are a workers' party. We feel like it's a responsible thing to do to make sure we make investments that create good opportunities for work for now and the long term. Workers deserve that predictability, deserve that stability. That's the type of decisions we'd make. We would prioritize investing in renewable energy, prioritize training workers and supporting workers for the jobs of today and tomorrow. We would use those same skills in retrofitting abandoned oil wells, in converting them into geothermal energy production. We would also use those same skills in the retrofitting of industrial buildings and commercial buildings. There's incredible opportunities for work and to fight the climate crisis, and that's what we're about. We are a workers' party that is committed to fighting the climate crisis, and to do that, we need to make sure workers are part of the solution.
Next question, Mackenzie Gray, CTV News.
Good morning, Mr. Singh.
Morning.
For many decades, the heart of the NDP has been big unions, and you've got the support of a number of them. But one union you don't have the support of broadly has been Unifor. Jerry Dias has been telling people to strategically vote in races where the Liberals can win to defeat the Conservatives, vote for them. In races the NDP can win, vote for the NDP. If you can't convince Jerry Dias and Unifor to not strategically vote, how do you think you're going to convince Canadians who are concerned about a Conservative government that they should vote for you?
I'm going to put to Canadians the cost of voting for Mr. Trudeau. There's a cost. It's not a free vote, and that cost is too high. The cost of Mr. Trudeau promising Indigenous communities clean drinking water and then breaking that promise means there are people in our country that can't turn the tap on and drink the water. The cost to families in their pocketbooks of the promises to lower the cell phone and internet bills, that is a real cost, and people have felt that cost even more in this pandemic when we've needed to use our cell phone and internet for work and for education and for services. There's a cost to voting for Mr. Trudeau. That cost is too high. There's a cost when he breaks his promise around pharmacare. There were families, there are people that tell me that they were looking forward to, with relief, the idea that there would be a universal pharmacare so that they wouldn't have to pay for their medication anymore. They wouldn't have to worry about it. There's a kid that I met, or a young person I met, who's graduating from university, who is excited, was excited when the promise was made because they have coverage, they have a late onset diabetes, and they're like, okay, this happened to me late in my life, and in my university years, I've gotten diabetes now, type 1, and I've got to pay for all this medication, but I got coverage. I'm in university. And they were worried, what happens when I graduate, when I lose that coverage? And they were excited, saying, okay, you know what, I'm going to get this universal pharmacare. It's going to be okay for me. I'm not going to worry about it. Now she is worried that when she graduates, she's not going to be able to pay for her medication. That's the cost of Mr. Trudeau breaking his promises. So to folks out there, if you are worried about any of these things and you care about these things, the only way to get them is to vote for New Democrats.
6 days ago in the Toronto Sun, Jerry Dias wrote a column, quote, "Conservatives won't advance union rights in this country." And he completely disagrees with the assessment and the analysis that you make that Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole are the same. He's come out strongly and said, Mr. O'Toole is considerably worse for this country than Mr. Trudeau. He'd, in Essex, say, vote for Tracy Ramsey. She's got the best chance to beat the Conservatives. But in many other ridings, he'd say, vote for the Liberals because they have the best chance to beat the Conservatives. So again, how are you going to convince Canadians to vote for you when you're sitting third in the polls, when big unions are saying, in some cases, vote for the NDP, but in lots of other cases, vote for the Liberals?
I'd say to people, if do you care about who pays the price of this pandemic? Do you believe that it should be you or your families, or do you believe it should be the billionaires that have gotten a free ride? If you believe it should be the billionaires, if you believe it should be folks with fortunes of over 10 million that contribute a little bit more, a little more fairly, then the option for them is New Democrats. For people who believe that we got to get rid of for-profit long-term care, it's certainly not going to be Mr. Trudeau. He voted against eliminating that greed. He voted against getting that profit out. So for folks who care about getting rid of profit in long-term care, Mr. Trudeau isn't your option. Mr. O'Toole is certainly not your option. New Democrats are your option. And so we're going to lay it out. I'm laying it out to Canadians. There is a cost to Mr. Trudeau. And for the things that matters to Canadians, healthcare, who pays the price of this pandemic, making sure your life is more affordable, New Democrats are your option. And I'll encourage people again, not just here in Essex voting for Tracy, but everywhere in Canada, vote for New Democrats. They're the ones that are going to fight for you.
This concludes our press conference. Thank you, Merci.
Thanks so much.